The air tasted of dust and powdered concrete, a thick, chalky grit that coated the tongue and throat. Sachiko Miyagi held her 4-year-old daughter, Yuki, tighter, her own body a fragile shield against the crushing weight of the world that had collapsed upon them. The thunderous American artillery barrage, a hellish symphony that had shaken the very foundations of Okinawa for what felt like an eternity, had ceased 20 minutes ago. In its wake, a deafening silence had fallen, broken only by the occasional groan of tortured wood and the shifting of masonry above their heads. Their small home in Shori village had become their tomb. The main living area miraculously intact, but buried deep beneath the rubble of what had been the second floor and the roof. A single sliver of grey smoke, streaked light pierced the darkness, filtering through the gap where their kitchen window had once framed a view of a cherry blossom tree. Now splintered and burning, Yuki whimpered, a tiny, muffled sound against her mother's chest. Sachiko shushed her gently, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she feared the Americans might hear it. They were out there. She could hear them now, the guttural, alien sounds of their English speech, the heavy crunch of their boots on the debris outside. Every lesson, every warning from the Kempitai, the military police, echoed in her mind with the force of prophecy. The Americans are demons, subhuman monsters. They will show no mercy. For women, a fate worse than death awaits. For children, slaughter or slavery. Death before capture. Death before dishonor. She had practiced it with the other women in the neighborhood association. They had been given grenades. Some had received vials of poison. A clean death was the only honorable option when the demons came. Trembling, she adjusted her grip on the long, sharpened bamboo stake she had kept close. It was a pitiful weapon against guns, but it would be enough. For herself first, then for Yuki. A final, desperate act of love to spare them, both the unspeakable horrors that capture would bring. She readied the point against her own throat, her eyes fixed on the sliver of light, waiting for the shadow of a demon to block it out. Then, she heard it. A voice calling out in broken, heavily accented, but unmistakable Japanese. Dereka imasuka? Tasukumasu? Is anyone there? We'll help you! The words made no sense. They were a trick, a deception to lure them out. Sachiko froze, the bamboo stake trembling in her hand. Yuki stirred, hearing the familiar words from an unfamiliar source. Mama, someone is here. Quiet, my heart. Sachiko whispered, her voice cracking with fear. Be absolutely quiet. The crunching of boots grew closer. A shadow fell across the beam of light. Then, a face appeared in the gap, blocking the light. It was not the face of a demon. It was a young man. His features streaked with sweat and grime, his eyes a startling shade of blue, squinting as they adjusted to the dimness. He wore a helmet, and his uniform was filthy, but his expression was not one of hatred or bloodlust. It was one of cautious concern. Hello, he said, switching back to English, his voice softer now. Anyone alive in there? Sachiko clutched Yuki, pressing her face into her shoulder so she wouldn't see. This was it, the moment of truth. She braced herself. The soldier, Private Danny Kowalski from Detroit, didn't reach for his rifle. Instead, he began carefully, painstakingly, to pull away the smaller pieces of rubble blocking the opening, his movements slow and deliberate. He was talking the whole time, a low, soothing murmur, though they couldn't understand the words. When the hole was large enough, he slung his rifle on his back and crawled through, his large frame awkward in the confined space. He saw them then, huddled in the corner. A woman, terrified, clutching a child and what looked like a sharpened stick. He stopped moving, holding his hands up, palms open, showing he was unarmed. It's okay, he said softly. It's okay. We're here to help. Sachiko stared, her mind reeling. This was not what she had been prepared for. This calm, this gentleness. It defied all logic. The propaganda had spoken of rage, of bestial fury. This man was being careful not to startle them. His eyes fell on the beam that had fallen across Sachiko's legs, pinning her to the floor. He pointed to it, then to her, a question in his eyes. She gave a tiny, hesitant nod. He moved forward, and for a flinching moment, Sachiko thought he was coming to attack. Instead, he positioned his shoulders under the heavy timber, his muscles straining as he lifted it. Just enough for her to slide her legs out. The pain was immediate and sharp, but she was free. He then turned his attention to Yuki. He smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes, and slowly reached into a pocket. He pulled out a small, strange object, wrapped in waxed paper. He unwrapped it partially, revealing a brown square. He mimed eating it, then held it out to Yuki. "Chocolate," he said. "For you." Yuki, her innate childhood curiosity overcoming her fear, looked from the strange brown thing to the soldier's face. Sachiko's grip tightened, but the man made no sudden moves. He just kept smiling, holding the offering. Tentatively, Yuki reached out and took it. She took a small bite, her eyes widening at the strange, sweet, rich flavor. A tiny smile touched her lips. The soldier Kowalski chuckled softly. "Good, huh?" He then gestured that he was going to pick Yuki up. Sachiko wanted to protest, to fight, but she was paralyzed by the sheer dissonance of the situation. He lifted Yuki with an easy strength, his movements incredibly gentle, and carried her to the opening, passing her carefully to another soldier waiting outside. Then he turned back for Sachiko. As he helped her to her feet, her legs screaming in protest, the sharp crack of a machine gun echoed from a nearby ridge. A Japanese position. Without a moment's hesitation, Kowalski threw his body over hers, shielding her as he half dragged her toward the opening. They scrambled out into the devastated landscape of what was once their village. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of cordite. Other American soldiers were moving through the rubble, some establishing a perimeter. Others tending to a small group of dazed and wounded Okinawan civilians who were being led toward a tent with a red cross painted on it. Kowalski stayed with them, his body a constant shield as sporadic fire continued from the Japanese lines. He guided Sachiko and Yuki toward the aid station, his focus entirely on their safety. For Sachiko, who had been conditioned to expect slaughter, the most shocking revelation of defeat came not from brutality, but from an enemy soldier risking his own life to protect the very people he was supposed to exterminate. The foundation of her entire reality, built meticulously on months of fear, mongering, began to crumble into dust, more thoroughly than any bombed outbuilding ever could. The propaganda had been comprehensive and thorough. A relentless psychological campaign designed to prevent surrender and ensure continued resistance, even in the face of certain military defeat. Radio broadcasts had crackled with warnings. Military announcements had been read in every village square, and neighborhood association meetings had spent hours painting the Americans as subhuman monsters who committed atrocities for pleasure. They were portrayed as mixed race demons, a horde without honor, mercy, or any recognizable human emotion. Children learned chilling songs in school about brave Japanese soldiers and civilians who chose a glorious death over the dishonor of capture. School lessons explicitly taught that falling into American hands meant torture, mutilation, and degradation so profound that suicide was the only honorable choice. Village leaders, under orders from the military, had repeated the grim directive that anyone showing a white flag or attempting to surrender would be executed as traitors to the emperor. Families were instructed to kill themselves, and the means were distributed. Hand grenades for collective suicide, potassium cyanide vials for the individual. The conditioning was so absolute that many civilians, like Sachiko, genuinely believed that a quick, self-inflicted death was infinitely preferable to the unspeakable evil that American capture represented. As American forces advanced through the labyrinth of Okinawan villages and towns, they encountered a civilian population that had been systematically terrorized by its own government. The soldiers, expecting fanatical resistance from military holdouts, were utterly unprepared for the tragic scenes they discovered. They found families, fathers, mothers, grandparents, children, who had chosen mass suicide rather than accept what they believed was certain torture at American hands. They found bodies huddled around exploded grenades, parents who had taken the lives of their children before their own. This grim reality created a profound and disturbing psychological impact on the young Americans, who had never imagined that their mere approach could trigger such a horrific, self-destructive response. The nature of the combat itself was a new and brutal experience. The urban warfare required to clear tenacious Japanese defensive positions inevitably bled into civilian areas where families, too slow or too frightened to evacuate, had become trapped. American forces found themselves in a constant, agonizing dual role engaging a determined, often invisible enemy, while simultaneously trying to protect the non-combatants caught in the crossfire. The rules of engagement emphasized civilian protection, but the chaotic reality of street-by-street, house-by-house fighting made such protection incredibly difficult, especially when Japanese forces deliberately used civilian homes, schools, and hospitals as fortified positions. American soldiers faced impossible dilemmas daily, forced to make split-second decisions under fire that balanced military necessity against humanitarian obligation. For many, who had fought previous campaigns in the Pacific on isolated islands with only military garrisons, the presence of families, the elderly, and children in a combat zone was a shocking and deeply challenging adjustment. Corporal Bobby Martinez from San Antonio had fought through 2 years of relentless Pacific campaigns, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the black sands of Iwo Jima. He thought he had seen everything the Japanese military had to offer, but nothing had prepared him for Okinawa's civilians. "We found them everywhere," he would later write to his wife, his handwriting shaky as he composed the letter by flashlight in his foxhole. Old folks, women, little kids, hiding in basements and bombed out houses. They were so scared they couldn't even cry when they saw us coming. Some of them tried to kill themselves rather than be captured. We had to move real slow and gentle, like you would with a spooked animal, to convince them we weren't going to hurt them. We'd smile, offer a canteen of water, a piece of candy. You could see the confusion in their eyes. It was like watching someone wake up from a terrible nightmare, only to find out the nightmare was real, but the monster wasn't what they thought. The civilian response to American contact was a spectrum of terror. Some would scream and try to flee, often into more dangerous areas. Others would freeze, catatonic with fear. The most heartbreaking were those who, true to their conditioning, would produce a hidden grenade or a knife, forcing the Americans to make a terrible choice, or would simply try to throw themselves from a cliff or into the path of fire. But gradually, as the evidence of American intentions accumulated through these patient, non-threatening encounters, a fragile trust began to form. The process was slow, often taking hours or even days of consistent, kind behavior to overwrite months of vicious propaganda. The medical imperative became one of the most powerful tools in this battle for trust. American medics, trained to deal with bullet wounds and shrapnel injuries, found themselves facing a different kind of casualty. The civilians they encountered were often on the brink of collapse from malnutrition, dehydration, and disease. They had been hiding for weeks with little food or clean water, their immune systems weakened, their bodies succumbing to infections and illnesses that would have been trivial in peacetime. Staff Sergeant James Sullivan, an army medic from a small town in Vermont, found his skills and his supplies stretched in ways he had never anticipated. His kit was designed for trauma, not for treating starving children or elderly civilians, suffering from dysentery and pneumonia. They were in terrible shape. He documented in his official medical reports, the clinical language failing to capture the depth of the suffering he witnessed. Children with infected wounds that hadn't been treated for weeks, old people who were dehydrated and literally starving to death, women who had been heroically trying to hold their families together with absolutely no resources. We gave them what we had: water, food from our own rations, sulfur drugs, vitamins. But it was obvious they'd been suffering for a long, long time before we ever got here. The professional, compassionate medical care administered without any expectation of payment or even gratitude proved to be an undeniable demonstration of American humanitarian intent. It was a tangible, life-saving rebuttal to the claims of American barbarism. Where words failed, actions built bridges. The language barrier between the American GIs and the Okinawan civilians was immense. But it created a space where simple, human gestures could speak volumes. The act of offering a canteen of water to a thirsty child, sharing a K-ration biscuit with a starving old woman, or carefully cleaning and bandaging a wound. These actions communicated a fundamental humanity that transcended nationality and ideology. The few American personnel who could speak Japanese became invaluable, their ability to translate not just words, but intentions, serving as a crucial lifeline of reassurance. Sergeant Robert Yamamoto, a Nizi soldier from California, whose parents had immigrated from Hiroshima, found himself at the center of this cultural collision. His very existence in an American uniform was a shock to the civilians he encountered. They couldn't believe it at first. He recalled years later. The propaganda had told them that all Japanese people in America had been killed or put in chains as slaves. When they saw me, when they heard me speak their language perfectly, it broke their brains for a minute. I had to explain that no, my family was safe back in California. That I had grown up American, but we still celebrated Obon and New Year's. That I was fighting for my country, America. Learning that, it challenged everything they thought they knew. It made them question what else they had been told about us. It was the children, however, who often proved to be the most effective ambassadors. Their natural resilience and curiosity made them less bound by the ingrained fears of their elders. A soldier's smile, a piece of candy, a funny face. These small gestures could break through the wall of terror where more reasoned approaches might fail. The American GIs, many of whom were fathers and brothers back home, were instinctively drawn to the children. The distribution of candy, chewing gum, and small toys became a standard practice, a visible, powerful symbol that these soldiers valued child welfare, that they possessed the same nurturing instincts as any other human being. 8-year-old Hiroshi Nakamura had been hiding with his family and several others in the basement of a bombed-out school building for over a week when an American patrol discovered them. His initial reaction was one of pure, unadulterated terror, clutching his mother's legs and hiding his face. But then one of the soldiers, a lanky man named Corporal Eddie Rodriguez from New Mexico, knelt down. He didn't come closer. He just smiled, his teeth very white in his dusty face, and held out a small, crinkly, wrapped bar. "Chocolate," he said, slowly and carefully. "Ushi?" "Delicious." Hiroshi stared, mesmerized. The soldier had kind eyes, not the monstrous, furious eyes he had been told to expect. After a long, hesitant moment, Hiroshi crept forward and took the offering. He had never seen or tasted chocolate before. The flavor was incredible. A complex sweetness that exploded on his tongue. He looked up at the soldier, who was watching him with a pleased expression, and gave a small, tentative smile of his own. That simple interaction did more to calm the adults in the basement than any number of translated assurances. If the soldier was kind to the child, perhaps he could be trusted. Not all rescues were quiet affairs. Many occurred in the midst of ongoing combat, requiring American soldiers to perform acts of extraordinary courage that went far beyond the call of military duty. Pulling civilians from burning buildings, digging them out of collapsed structures under sniper fire, and carrying them to safety across open ground swept by machine guns. These actions demonstrated a commitment to civilian welfare that was impossible to fake. Private First Class Tony Rizzo from Brooklyn found himself volunteering for one such dangerous rescue after another. His squad mates called him crazy, but he had a knack for it. I grew up in tenements where fires and building collapses happened all the time. Rizzo explained simply. You learned how to listen for people trapped under rubble, how to shore up a beam to keep a ceiling from coming down. When I saw those civilians, especially the kids stuck in those ruins, I couldn't just leave them there. Yeah, it was dangerous. The snipers were still active, and you never knew when a Jap soldier might pop out of a tunnel. But what kind of person walks away from someone who needs help just because it's risky? We're Americans. We're supposed to be the good guys, right? This, sniper's dilemma, created a strange, unspoken moral complexity on the battlefield. American rescue operations often proceeded with a surprising degree of safety, not because the Japanese weren't watching, but because they were. Japanese soldiers, dug into the surrounding hills and ruins, frequently held their fire when they saw Americans, extracting Japanese civilians from danger. They were faced with their own impossible choice: take the shot at the enemy and risk killing their own countrymen, or hold their fire and allow the rescue to proceed. Many chose the latter. This created a bizarre, indirect form of cooperation between enemies, a shared, unspoken priority for civilian lives that momentarily transcended the kill, or killed logic of war. For the Americans involved, it was a startling revelation that their enemy, however fanatical, also possessed a line they were unwilling to cross when it came to their own people. The generosity of the American forces was another source of profound cognitive dissonance for the Okinawans. Despite their own logistical challenges, the GIs shared their rations, medical supplies, and equipment with a consistency that suggested not just individual kindness, but official policy. K rations and C rations, which the Americans sometimes complained about, were a feast to civilians who had been surviving on scraps of dried fish and whatever roots or grasses they could scavenge. The canned meat, crackers, chocolate, and even the cigarettes represented a level of abundance that was almost incomprehensible. The Americans could afford to give away what seemed like vast quantities of high-quality food. This casual generosity was a powerful, silent testament to America's industrial might and its commitment to humanitarian principles, even in the midst of a brutal invasion. Mess Sergeant Frank Kowalski, no relation to Danig, supervised a field kitchen that increasingly found itself cooking for dozens, then hundreds, of civilian mouths. We started cooking extra rice, making big pots of soup with whatever vegetables we could scrounge up. He remembered. We tried to prepare food that would be easy for the kids and the old folks to digest. These people were starving, literally starving, and we had more food than we needed. It wasn't about being heroic. It was just basic human decency. You see a hungry person, you feed them. It's that simple. This decency extended to a surprising level of cultural sensitivity. American soldiers, often through trial and error, and with the help of their Nice interpreters, learned to remove their boots before entering a home that was still standing, to bow respectfully to the elderly, and to address people with a degree of formality. They made efforts to provide culturally appropriate assistance, seeking out tofu and miso when possible, respecting religious sites, and working with local Buddhist and Shinto priests. Military chaplains collaborated with these religious leaders to offer comfort and conduct funerals for the dead. This demonstrated a respect for Japanese culture and spirituality that directly contradicted the propaganda about American barbarism and Christian intolerance. The consistency of this respectful behavior across different units and divisions indicated it was a deeply ingrained institutional value, not just the whim of a few kind-hearted individuals. The medical care provided by the Americans often had results that seemed nothing short of miraculous. The availability of antibiotics, like penicillin, could snatch a child back from the brink of death from a simple infection. Skilled surgeons performed operations that saved limbs and lives. For a population that had been without any meaningful medical care for months, the sight of a high fever breaking overnight, or a festering wound cleaning up and healing was a powerful, tangible proof of American goodwill. Dr. Robert Sterling, an Army physician from Boston, ran a mobile medical unit that became a beacon of hope for the civilians in his sector. We saw the full spectrum of human suffering. He wrote in his journal, "Children on the verge of death from dysentery and dehydration, brought back to life with IV fluids. Elderly people with pneumonia, saved by sulfur drugs. Families who had been living in caves, suffering from malnutrition and parasites, given a chance at health with proper food and medicine. The treatments we provided, which were standard for us, made differences that they saw as miracles. You cannot argue with a miracle. A mother who sees her child recover from a deadly fever because of American medicine will never again believe that Americans are demons." The American commitment extended beyond immediate survival to rebuilding the foundations of civil society. Combat engineers, whose training was focused on building bridges, airstrips, and fortifications, found themselves tasked with restoring civilian infrastructure. They repaired shattered water mains, restored electrical grids, and cleared roads of debris. They rebuilt schools and community centers. Captain William Hayes, who commanded one such engineer battalion, saw the strategic value in this. "We weren't just winning battles," he explained to a visiting journalist. "We were proving to these people that Americans could build as well as we could destroy. That we cared about their communities and their futures, not just about defeating their military. We were showing them what peace under American administration could look like, and it looked a hell of a lot better than the war the Japanese military had brought them." This Hearts and Minds campaign even included educational outreach. American personnel, often those with teaching backgrounds back home, worked with surviving Japanese teachers to set up temporary schools in whatever buildings were available. They provided books, paper, pencils, and other supplies that had been destroyed or were unavailable for months. For the children, the return to a semblance of normalcy, the routine of school, the joy of learning, was profoundly stabilizing. For their parents, the American investment in their children's education was a stunning vote of confidence in a shared future. It signaled that the Americans saw these children not as enemies, but as the next generation who would inherit a peaceful, rebuilt Okinawa. The cumulative psychological impact of all these actions, the rescues, the medical care, the food, the respect, the rebuilding, was a gradual but profound transformation among the civilian population. The wall of fear, so meticulously constructed by Japanese propaganda, began to crumble, brick by brick, replaced by a fragile but growing trust. This transformation was not instantaneous or universal. Some holdouts, particularly the elderly, remained deeply suspicious for a long time. But the evidence was overwhelming and consistent. The Americans were not demons. They were, for the most part, kind, generous, and surprisingly normal young men who missed their homes and families, who liked to joke and play baseball, and who went out of their way to help those in need. Children, with their inherent honesty and lack of prejudice, were often the first to embrace this new reality. They would follow American patrols, practicing their few words of English, begging for gum or chocolate. They would teach the GIs Japanese words and games. These simple, human friendships between American soldiers and Japanese children became one of the most powerful forces for reconciliation, slowly convincing the adult population that cooperation was not just safe, but beneficial. The strategic impact of this humanitarian policy was immense. Civilian cooperation provided invaluable intelligence about hidden Japanese military positions and storage caches. It facilitated the administration of the island and sped up the process of economic recovery, which in turn reduced the burden on American occupation forces. On a broader scale, it provided a powerful narrative for the post-war world. America as a nation that waged war with necessary force, but followed it with unprecedented generosity. It undermined the remaining Japanese military resistance, as stories of American kindness filtered back to the holdouts, encouraging surrender over suicidal last stands. The psychological blow this policy dealt to the Japanese militarist ideology was, in its own way, as decisive as any military victory. The individual stories became the human heart of this larger historical drama. For the American soldiers, the experience was often deeply conflicted. After weeks of brutal combat, against a foe known for his refusal to surrender, the sudden shift to being a protector and benefactor was jarring. Many struggled with the emotional whiplash, trying to reconcile the image of the fanatical Japanese soldier with the reality of the terrified, grateful civilian. For the Okinawans, accepting help from the enemy was also fraught with complex emotions. Immense gratitude mixed with a lingering sense of guilt and confusion over their own military's failure and the lies they had been told. The ultimate paradox of the Battle of Okinawa was this. The same military machine capable of unleashing unimaginable destruction was also capable of demonstrating extraordinary, life-saving compassion. For the civilians like Sachiko Miyagi, this contradiction forced a complete re-evaluation of everything they thought they knew about good and evil, friend and foe. The shock came not from the violence they had expected, but from the kindness they had been assured was impossible. In the end, the most enduring memory for those who lived through the hell was not of the roar of the guns or the terror of the shelling. It was the memory of a young American soldier from Detroit, crawling into the rubble of a shattered home, his hands empty of weapons, offering not death, but life. It was the memory of a shared piece of chocolate, a gentle smile, a protective arm shielding them from harm. These acts of individual humanity, repeated thousands of times across the devastated landscape, proved more powerful than any propaganda. They were a testament to the idea that even in the heart of war, mercy could persist, that strength was defined not only by the power to destroy, but by the courage to save, and that from the ashes of a bitter conflict, the seeds of a lasting peace could be sown, built on the simple, unshakable foundation of a shared humanity, recognized and honored by former enemies. The hands that reached out from the rubble were not the claws of demons, but the hands of rescuers, pulling them from the darkness of war toward the uncertain, but hopeful, light of a shared future.